I mean, I can see at least 32 people waiting on YouTube.
I started, sir.
Okay.
Now it's live. Oh, everyone can see you now.
Okay, great. Darshan and Kavita, are we ready to get started? Kavita, Sangamesh, are we ready to?
Deepak, you could go ahead.
Okay, all right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Deepak Malghan. I'm on the faculty at the Center for Public Policy here at IIM Bangalore. Thank you all for joining this long-awaited seminar. As some of you know, this talk was originally scheduled for the last week of March as an on-campus event. I still hope to get Professor Subramanian to deliver an in-person lecture the next time she's actually able to travel to Bangalore. I know several of my faculty and graduate student colleagues had signed up to meet with Ajantha. The upside of this virtual seminar is that it has allowed people who would have otherwise found it impossible to negotiate traffic on Banerghatta Road to join an on-campus lecture. It's a real privilege to be able to introduce Ajantha. Professor Subramanian is a professor of anthropology and South Asian studies at Harvard University and currently also chairs the anthropology department there. Her first book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, published by Stanford University Press in 2009, chronicles the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast, with a focus on how they've used spatial imaginaries and practices to constitute themselves as political subjects. Her latest book, from which she is speaking this evening, is Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, published by Harvard University Press late last year. The book studies meritocracy as a terrain of caste struggle in India and its implication for democratic transformation. This book has already received rave reviews. I'm sure some of you have read those reviews, if not the book. Both within and outside the academy, it's rare for an academic tome such as this to attract the attention that this book has. This book truly speaks to our times and across multiple registers. I'm personally indebted to Professor Subramanian for being one of the intellectual champions of caste justice on Indian campuses. Her 2015 article, which she uses in her book, Making Merit, published in the Comparative Studies in Society and History, played a major role in catalyzing ongoing advocacy by enlightened IIM alumni group, many of whom are also IIT alums. This is an effort that is ongoing and has pushed IIMs to seriously engage with questions of social diversity on our campuses for the first time. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Ajantha Subramanian.
Thanks so much, Professor Malghan. This is a really generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I wish it could have been in person, but at least technology has made it possible for us to have an event of this kind. As I was saying to you earlier, the pandemic has been such a strange experience. It has been so isolating, but it has also allowed me to be in conversation with so many different Indian audiences over the past few months. And for that, I have been deeply grateful. So let me go ahead and read the talk. It should be about 40 minutes, and I look forward to your questions. The title of the talk is Meritocracy and Democracy, the Social Life of Caste in India. In India today, the term merit is a ubiquitous term that generates a lot of political heat. Over the post-independence period, merit has come to reference forms of distinction that have a much longer social life. And while there are various social distinctions that are at stake in public debates around who does or does not have merit, the most politically charged point of reference is caste. The relationship between caste and merit is widely debated, but nowhere more vocally and consistently than in engineering education. Within the world of Indian engineering education, the institutions seen as most meritocratic are the IITs, which are the focus of my research. A set of originally 5 institutions founded between 1951 and 61 and deemed institutions of national importance by the IIT Act of 1961, the IITs are directly administered and financed by the Indian central government and fall outside the structure of affiliation to universities, which gives them far greater autonomy in institutional functioning, faculty hiring, and curricular development. Their autonomy was guaranteed in other ways as well. In the name of ensuring merit as the only basis for admission, they were originally exempted from reservation policies. Soon after their founding, the IITs became stepping stones to transnational mobility, especially to the United States. From the 1970s, the professional and economic successes of IIT alumni in both India and the US generated a mad rush to gain admission, pushing the number of candidates steadily upward and spawning a massive coaching industry to train students in exam preparation. Within Indian public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit, someone seen as naturally gifted in technical knowledge. What gets occluded in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the forms of historical advantage that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper caste families of bureaucrats and academics, where capital has long been held in education. While arguably from middle-class backgrounds, the value of their accumulated caste capital has spiked due to the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy. At the same time, the role of caste and state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. The IIT story provokes some important questions. How does historical advantage become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit inform understandings of caste difference? And what does this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? Before I turn to the research, let me say a little about my reasons for taking on this project. One of the main aims was to interrogate the widespread assumption that caste is a more salient basis of social distinction and self-definition for lower than for upper caste. More specifically, upper caste, so-called upper caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. At the same time, professional classes and institutional spaces like the IITs continue to be largely upper caste in composition. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to so-called lower castes are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. Despite continuing caste stratification and the claims to merit by upper castes, there is little scholarship that brings these issues together. And this is where I see my work coming in. I look at the role of engineering education and the IITs in particular in producing claims to merit as expressions of upper caste identity. To get at the relationship between caste and merit, I build on the work of sociologists Pierre Bourdieu and Satish Deshpande. In his essay, The Forms of Capital, Bourdieu offers an insightful analysis of what he calls embodied cultural capital, those accumulated effects of family and class history that become an integral part of the person, and usually recognized not as capital, but as competence. In this way, he says, embodied cultural capital, quote, manages to combine the prestige of innate property with the merits of acquisition, unquote. He goes on to note that there is an inherent instability to embodied capital that is stabilized through forms of institutional recognition, such as academic qualifications. Such institutional mediation endows cultural capital with greater legitimacy and makes it into a currency more easily traded in the marketplace. Bourdieu's analysis dovetails nicely with the work of Deshpande on how upper castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how upper castes transformed their caste capital into modern capital is not well known, he says, because it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense. When it is seen and heard, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building, for example. By contrast, the political use of caste by lower castes is a recurrent, publicly debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, Deshpande maintains, is that the upper castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while lower castes are hyper-visible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. For upper castes, he concludes, quote, caste qua caste has already yielded all that it can and represents a ladder that can now be safely kicked away. Having encashed its traditional caste capital and converted it into modern forms of capital like property, higher educational credentials, and strongholds in lucrative professions, this section believes itself to be casteless today, unquote. My work builds on Bourdieu and Deshpande, but adds a key component, which is the relationship between subaltern assertion and capital accumulation. Strategies of upper caste capital accumulation must be understood in relation to oppositional politics. This allows us to see how caste emerges out of longer historical dynamics and continues to be reconfigured in the context of democratic politics. But it is also to make the larger point that historical advantage does not simply reproduce itself. The proliferation of rights politics and the entry of new groups into social and economic spaces previously monopolized by upper castes have posed real challenges to caste hierarchies. The claim to merit is one strategy aimed at stabilizing the flux of political life in order to secure arenas of expertise and accumulation against lower caste advancement. However, even this claim to merit is not a guarantee and has to be continuously recalibrated in the face of new challenges. My work on the IITs tracks such changing expressions of upper caste identity. While I look at the IIT system as a whole, my main focus is on IIT Madras. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at the relationship between lower caste assertion and upper caste capital accumulation because its history of caste politics has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper castes into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with histories of lower caste rights, merit is understood as a product of historical advantage and not simply of innate ability. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of upper caste self-definition. Departing from his analysis, I ask how dynamics in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. When are claims to merit made on the basis of castelessness and when on the basis of caste? What are the forms of embodied cultural capital that continue to mark status and stigma, even in the absence of explicit invocations of caste? Let me now turn to my research. I'll first give you a brief account of the role of caste in colonial technical education, and then turn to IIT Madras and the making of upper caste identity through claims to merit. For the post-independence period, I will look specifically at three phenomena: reservations, mass examinations, and transnational mobility, and use each to show how the contours of upper caste identity have shifted in response to new challenges. But first, let's go back to the 19th century. Caste played a critical role in the induction of Indians into formal technical training in the late colonial period. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, racial barriers to technical education were expressed through a clear preference for engineers from England. It was only with the rise in nationalist criticism of colonial rule and the expansion of public works that the colonial government began to invest more systematically in formal technical education for Indians. The question of what kind of training this would be and what kind of man was best suited to it was hotly debated. From the beginning, we see tensions between two views of engineering. The first expressed an older orientation around engineering as practical learning, unsuited to the classroom. The second, newer view argued for the importance of engineering as formal conceptual education aligned with the social hierarchies of the colony. While this debate endured into the 20th century, the call to formalize engineering as classroom education ultimately won out. Although technical skill was more clearly evident among lower caste artisans and tradesmen, the emerging consensus over engineering as classroom learning and its connection to state power made literate upper castes the principal targets of this new knowledge. In elevating the classroom as the principal site of engineering knowledge, education planners marginalized those who had technique in favor of those schooled in reading and writing. From the outset, we see a convergence between a colonial administrative sociology of caste, the stratification of technical training, and new modes of collective self-representation. Even as upper castes were inducted into modern professions where secular credentials were ostensibly more important than family and community, the preoccupation with caste-appropriate choices persisted. Rather than a shift from caste to castelessness, the modern engineer was always also a caste self. For their part, colonial officials were happy to accommodate caste prejudices in order to enhance the status and growth of engineering. In effect, upper caste status anxieties and colonial policy dovetailed in consigning those groups with a history of technical skill to the margins of the growing field of engineering. In many ways, Madras presidency was an extreme case of this caste stratification of technical training. Here, the categories of Brahmin and non-Brahmin had become foundational units of administrative sociology through which technical training was implemented. Through the 1910s, concern with the erosion of non-Brahmin and need to enhance hereditary skills in wood, metal, and textiles remained a centerpiece of technical policy in Madras. Such efforts distinguishing non-Brahmin from Brahmin pursuits strengthened and naturalized the link between caste and technical skill. The effects in the engineering field were clear. As the numbers of Europeans in Madras's engineering profession fell, Brahmins were the single largest group to fill the vacuum, despite being barely 3% of the regional population. The correlation between caste and occupation and the overrepresentation of Brahmins in the modern professions became a rallying cry of the non-Brahmin and Dravidian movements, which profoundly reshaped the Tamil political and social milieu. Within the technical sciences too, the impact of Dravidianism was far-reaching. The Southeast was one of the first regions where caste quotas in technical education and employment were implemented. These measures have had considerable success at changing the caste composition of engineering from the days when Tamil Brahmins filled over 70% of seats in regional engineering colleges. One of the lasting effects of Dravidianism has been a cleavage between Tamil Nadu's other castes and Tamil Brahmins, with caste privilege more closely tied to Brahminness than in many other parts of India. To turn Deshpande's argument on its head, Dravidianism interrupted the translation of caste capital into modern capital by making Brahmins in particular hyper-visible as castes, a move that has been an important catalyst for a more far-reaching politics of meritocracy. An early moment when we see the impact of Dravidianism is 1951, with the first post-independence legal challenge to caste quotas. Two Tamil Brahmin petitioners claimed that their fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination, guaranteed by Article 15.1 of the Constitution, was violated by regional quotas in medical and engineering colleges. The Madras High Court agreed. In a key passage, the judgment stated, and this is a long quote, "It may be that through the fortuitous operations of a rule, which in itself is not discriminatory, a special advantage is enjoyed by some citizens belonging to a particular caste or community. This advantage is not taken away by Article 15.1. If students belonging to a certain community or caste, by reason of their caste discipline, habits, and modes of life, satisfy the prescribed requirements in larger number than others, it is not permissible to shut them out on that score. It would be strange if, in this land of equality and liberty, a class of citizens should be constrained to wear the badge of inferiority because, forsooth, they have a greater aptitude for certain types of education than other classes, unquote. The judgment redefined caste in two ways: from a system of graded inequality into community life, and from a form of historical advantage into collective aptitude. Moreover, it identified the quota itself as the source of discrimination. Deshpande argues that the 1951 verdict offered upper castes a form of agency, quote, based on the universal normative position of castelessness. Constitutionally and legally, caste was henceforth to be recognized only as a source of disadvantage or vulnerability, not as a source of privilege or advantage, unquote. As such, he continues, it, quote, authored and disseminated a new kind of common sense, where the very definition of caste was truncated and equated with the lower castes, unquote. Significantly, this common sense only deepened after the courts shifted in favor of quotas. Those who qualified for quotas were included in the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who did not qualify were simply classed under the general category of merit-based admissions. This absenting of caste from the general category has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India. The distinction between the meritorious or casteless on one side and the reserved or caste-based on the other has allowed those who fall within the general category to invoke what Bourdieu calls, quote, an imaginary universe of perfect competition or perfect equality of opportunity, a world without inertia, without accumulation, without heredity or acquired properties, unquote, in order to argue that it is reservations and not historical privilege that produces inequality and undermines equal citizenship. However, there's another side to the 1951 judgment that also lives on. And this is the definition of caste as culture, as natural aptitude, and as the very basis of merit. The judgment set the stage for a politics of self-definition through which Tamil Brahmins equated caste belonging with having merit, which they argued was threatened by the very existence of the reserved category. With the expansion of lower caste rights politics across India, this claim to merit as the non-reserved has become a more generalized phenomenon, seen not just in legal challenges to reservations, but in collective protests and in more everyday practices. In this sense, caste dynamics in Tamil Nadu set an important precedent for making the general category a putatively democratic norm whose external limit is lower casteness. Let us now turn to the IITs to look more closely at how the Tamil Brahmin precedent set the stage for an expanding politics of meritocracy. As I noted earlier, three phenomena have been central to the making of upper caste identity at the IITs. The first is reservations. It was in the context of Tamil Brahmin legal challenges to reservations that IIT Madras was founded in 1959. As a central government institution exempt from regional caste quotas, it was quickly coveted by Tamil Brahmins as a meritocratic space, shielded from lower caste claims, where talent would find its due. This changed in 1973 when central government quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were extended to the IITs. Although there was opposition from all of the IITs, it was IIT Madras that led the charge in condemning the move as government overreach and a violation of meritocracy. Still, the extreme marginality and presumed intellectual inferiority of students admitted through the 1973 quota did little to destabilize an existing campus norms of IITians coming from families of upper caste civil servants with shared histories of education and employment. Within Tamil Nadu, it is Brahmins who historically formed the core of this group. Unlike upper caste from other parts of India, Tamil Brahmins as targets of Dravidian responded most defensively to the quota by claiming IIT Madras as their own. We see this in the story of Karthik, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus, who characterized IIT Madras as the singular ambition of Tamil Brahmin boys, shut out of regional education. For us, he told me, it was IIT Madras or nothing. All other colleges admit by caste. Only IIT is by merit. Immediately after disavowing the presence of caste at the IITs, Karthik emphasized how much IIT Madras felt like home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming upon entering the campus gates, where Brahmin Tamil was commonplace and where he experienced a form of caste kinship between Tamil Brahmin students and professors, expressed in shared intellectual projects and invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras was not simply a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a so-called non-Brahmin region. Lower caste Tamils who gained admission through the general category were also assumed to be Brahmin. Gopi, a non-Brahmin alumnus, told me a story that captured this perfectly. He was changing his clothes when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal. When I told him that I don't wear one, he paused and then asked, "Doesn't your mother get upset?" It never struck him that I was backward caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family. Gopi's experience speaks not to the castelessness of the IITian, but to the assumption that any Tamil who gets in on merit is by definition Brahmin. Other forms of embodied cultural capital were also thought to reflect Brahminness. The display of bodily neglect was one. Ratty t-shirts, torn jeans, and chappals signaled a Brahmin background where the consumption of knowledge was prized over and above commodity consumption. By contrast, dressing well was indicative of being a nouveau riche lower caste who didn't truly value knowledge. These assumptions acquired a disciplining force. Parani, a lower caste student from Chennai, told me how he made a point of switching out his chappals when he came back to his campus after weekends at home. It was just easier, he said, than standing out. This desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of a region where a history of quotas has brought increasing numbers of lower castes into previously upper caste institutional spaces. Here, IIT Madras serviced the need to once again differentiate high from low. As caste status boundaries were blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it was crucial to mark the lower caste Tamil, especially the one who got in through the general category, as Brahmin. It was a different story for scheduled castes who got in through the 1973 quota. One particularly telling instance was of Dinesh, a Dalit student who was a topper at a predominantly upper caste school in Chennai. Throughout his school days, he told me, his classmates would come up with elaborate explanations for why he was the exception that proved the norm of Dalit intellectual inferiority. Although his rank in the IIT admissions exam made him eligible for the general category, he decided to claim the quota to get a better choice of engineering branch, and because, as he put it, it was my right. To his frustration, this became evidence that, in the end, I couldn't make the cut. Even when I pointed out that if I hadn't taken a quota seat, one of them wouldn't have gotten in, they still pretended that I didn't have the marks to get in on merit. All of these instances, Gopi's misrecognition as Brahmin, Palani's sartorial code switching, and the denial of Dinesh's intellect, point to the non-fungibility of the general category. While it purportedly marks a form of achievement available to all, assumptions about the ascriptive bases of merit were ever present. Within IIT Madras, to be lower caste was to be non-meritorious. Moreover, non-Brahmin Tamils were forced to erase the complexity of their own history to produce flattened forms of caste difference that aligned with expectations of who did or didn't have merit. How then did this regional dynamic set a precedent for a wider politics of meritocracy? In the 1990s, lower caste rights politics spread to other parts of India, resulting in the emergence of new constituencies and parties. One of the outcomes of this political ferment was the implementation in 1990 and 2006 of new central government quotas for OBCs that, when combined with the 1973 quota, expanded the reserved category to nearly half the student body of central government institutions like the IITs. As a result, what had been a regional interplay of non-Brahmin claims to rights and Brahmin claims to merit expanded nationally. But now, when such claims were articulated, they expressed not Brahminness, but a consolidated form of upper caste identity. The 1990 quota ignited a firestorm in North India, with students engaging in street protests and masquerading as vendors, sweepers, and shoe shiners in a graphic depiction of their future reduction to lower caste labor. At the same time, one of the accusations leveled against the quota was that it was responsible for the spread of casteism, even of caste consciousness. Echoing the 1951 judgment, its detractors defined the quota as a violation of the ideal of equality and the reserved as singularly undeserving. The 2006 quota further entrenched the opposition between general and reserved as widely shared categories through which the Indian public understood caste difference. In news articles, films, jokes, and online debates emerged an upside-down world where stigmatization and exclusion were the plight of the general category, and the reserved were illegitimate beneficiaries of state corruption. Unmistakable in such commentary was the outrage at the disruption of a natural order where upper caste dominance was assumed to be a byproduct of talent and desert. At the IITs, the ramifications of expanding reservations has been far-reaching. The existence of an OBC quota has produced a more explicit association between the general category and being upper caste. Moreover, after 2008, private sector job recruiters have become vigilant about only hiring general category students. Several who got into IIT Madras through the 1973 and 2006 quotas recounted their chagrin at being pointedly asked for their JEE rank at the final stage of recruitment. Despite doing well up to that point, most didn't get the jobs. There is thus emerging a two-tier system of employment, which ensures that general category students are assumed to be upper caste, and only they are seen as legitimate IITians. To sum up this section, the expansion of reservations has expanded an identitarian politics of merit from regional to national scale. Just as Dravidianism catalyzed Tamil Brahmin claims to merit, now the expansion of lower caste rights nationally has led to a similarly reactive upper caste politics. Particularly in the context of higher education and private sector employment, the polarized categories of the general and the reserved have superseded more localized affiliations to become a new scale of caste difference. Still, this process of caste consolidation has not been smooth. The instability of upper caste identity becomes more evident when we consider the second phenomenon shaping dynamics at the IITs, which is the mass examination. The mass examination is commonly taken as an index of modern meritocracy. Unlike earlier processes of selection that explicitly favored a high-born elite, the mass examination was underwritten by an ideology of middle-class achievement, where labor would find its just rewards. Its scale and finely calibrated set of ranked outcomes stood in for a process of objective evaluation beyond social and political influence. However, this assumption is belied by the structuring force of economic and social relations and the ideological power of cultural assumptions. As filtering mechanisms, mass examinations typically favor those who come from histories of education and have a facility with this technical instrument. A case in point is the JEE, which arguably represents the fullest realization of India's examination fetish. It is widely perceived as a near perfect measure of merit because the pan-Indian scope of the exam is assumed to filter only the best out of a vast pool of applicants. However, it has been anything but a democratizing force. As noted earlier, the majority of IITians used to be the children of upper caste civil servants. Their parents, themselves participants in another all India ritual, which is the Union Public Service Commission exam, made a point of training their children to succeed in the intense competitiveness of examination culture. These structural continuities have made caste and class history key to exam success, even as perceptions of the UPSC and JEE as objective filters of individual ability have reinforced an ideology of meritocratic achievement. In this instance as well, a more explicit claim to merit as a caste trait was first expressed by Tamil Brahmins. From the 1940s, Tamil Brahmins who felt shut out of regional educational institutions and employment by the quota system invested heavily in exam preparation to enter central government colleges, schools, and bureaucracies, a phenomenon that one Tamil Brahmin IITian referred to as a caste culture of coaching. With the opening of IIT Madras, this caste culture was directed towards a new goal. I heard many stories of mothers burning the midnight oil with their children, coaxing them to do practice tests so they could crack the JEE. There's a palpable sense within these accounts of both resentment and intellectual superiority, a combined claim to being a scapegoated and a uniquely deserving and talented caste. In the past 10 years, JEE exam coaching that was once more of a Brahmin phenomenon has exploded into $1 billion industry. The expansion of coaching has shifted the class profile of students at IIT Madras to include a large contingent from rural upper caste families in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, a former director of IIT Madras clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally talented individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. In conversations with him and other IIT faculty and administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy, in the process admitting students through the general category who were not actually gifted. It is clear that this divide between the gifted and the coached is not about who attends coaching classes, since virtually all IITians do. Who then are the coached? When pushed on this, I heard that they were from less urban, less professional, and English-speaking backgrounds. They were the ones who attended the so-called coaching factories, where learning was rote, unlike the more boutique conceptual classes attended by the urban middle class. As with the performance of bodily neglect, the distinction between the gifted and the coached is understood through specific qualities. The one most often mentioned to me was groupism. Students from so-called coaching factories are routinely charged with changing campus culture by bringing in their regional affiliations and languages. Although Brahmin, Tamil, and Hindi are also heard quite commonly on campus, it is Telugu that is marked as regional and parochial. Of course, other forms of collectivity are key to what it means to be an IITian. I heard numerous stories of male bonding over all-night debates on everything from obscure mathematical formulas to the evidence of science in the Vedas. Such stories take place in the dorm room and not the classroom and are key to institutional kinship. But it is only Telugu speakers who are taken as a disruptive collective presence. In some ways, it is these students who most destabilize the equation of merit with being upper caste. As noted earlier, the implementation of the 2006 quota has made it even easier to consign all lower caste students to the undeserving reserved category. But Telugu students are problematic because they are the wrong kind of upper caste. Their rote learning, bad English, and open embrace of regionalism blur the boundary between the general and the reserved. To recap again, at the IITs, the challenges to upper caste dominance posed by successive waves of reservation produced a polarized student body and an incessant diagnostics of caste to root out the undeserving. However, the entry of Telugu students has been unsettling, leading those from class histories of higher education and professional employment to distinguish themselves not just from lower castes, but from non-ideal upper castes in order to claim merit as their exclusive property. That the claim to merit is in fact about property becomes clearer when we consider the final phenomenon, which is transnational mobility. Caste inheritances have long been key to mobility. Here too, the Tamil Brahmin story prefigures a more widespread pattern. Over the 20th century, and in the face of lower caste demands for the redistribution of power and resources, Tamil Brahmins have used mobility from countryside to city, from public to private sector, and from South India to the north and to other countries as a means to secure their economic and social standing. In Tamil Brahmin narratives, mobility comes across as an expression of cultural genius that across successive generations has allowed them to preserve merit against the odds. The Tamil Brahmin use of mobility as a form of maneuver anticipated similar trends across India. In the post-independence period, transnational mobility emerged as a key tool for a wider spectrum of upper castes looking to secure the conditions for capital accumulation in the face of lower caste demands for access to public education and state employment. From the 1960s, the US emerged as the favored destination and quickly became the most affluent and highly educated node of the diaspora. Diasporic success has been hugely significant for reinforcing the link between meritocracy and caste in India, even as caste privilege and disadvantage are less visible within the US public sphere. With geographical distance from India and from challenges to caste entitlement, upper caste achievement abroad appears to be simply a form of self-made success. At the same time, the highly selective character of the US Indian diaspora makes easier a seamless equation between being upper caste, being Indian, and having merit. Within the US Indian diaspora, IIT alumni have been particularly active in shoring up their status as uniquely meritocratic individuals. Particularly after the information technology boom of the 1990s, IITians in Silicon Valley began forging a new claim to merit as the basis of achievement. Now, however, it was a form of racial merit through which they sought to make Indianness synonymous with technical prowess and brand IIT with commodity value. The early 2000s was a critical time for this racial project. Various magazines featured articles on the IITs. Forbes did a story titled Indians of Silicon Valley. Business Week came out with India's Genius Factories. And in a more sardonic vein, Scott Adams, creator of the comic strip Dilbert, debuted an IITian named Ashok. Most important was a 2003 episode of the news show 60 Minutes on the IITs, a carefully curated bit of publicity featuring choice quotes from prominent alumni that made the case for diasporic success as a natural extension of an IIT education. One of the highlights of the piece is an interview with Vinod Khosla, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, who observes that Fortune 500 headhunters favor IITians over almost anybody else. As he put it, if you're a WASP, that is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, if you're a WASP walking in for a job, you wouldn't have as much pre-assigned credibility as you do if you're an engineer from IIT. This project of self-racialization has been yoked to the cultivation of entrepreneurship. The Indus Entrepreneurs, an organization started by IIT alumni in Silicon Valley, currently boasts a membership of over 13,000, and its list of mentors includes the most well-recognized Indian names in the corporate sector. In conversations with both senior mentors and junior members of the organization, it became obvious that the entrepreneurial ambitions of IITians are the most actively cultivated. When a group of IITians brings forward a proposal, they're almost guaranteed seed funding. These expressions of transnational institutional kinship have both underwritten the commodity value of an IIT education and enhanced the racial mystique around the IITians' intellect. Together, such media events and institutional mechanisms have worked to elevate the status of the IITs and their diasporic ambassadors. But they have also produced new schisms between diasporic and homeland IITians. It is clear from speaking to Silicon Valley IITians that they share an imagination of constraint and possibility. As do homeland alumni, they insist that in India, they were limited by a system that fostered mediocrity in the name of democracy, and where the IITs were islands of meritocracy. But there's also something new. In their embrace of entrepreneurial wealth accumulation as the basis of merit, IITians in Silicon Valley are increasingly at odds with an older upper caste orientation around higher education and lifelong professional employment. Moreover, although most are the children of civil servants and public sector engineers, they have gone from being beneficiaries of the developmental state to its most strident detractors. Significantly, their disdain for the Indian public sector now also extends to homeland IITians. As they see it, Indian conditions have forced IITians who stayed behind to slip into mediocrity themselves, with the result that only the diasporic IITian truly embodies brand IIT. The diasporic project of brand elevation has certainly had an impressive reach. When I asked IIT students in the late 2000s about their role models, most mentioned Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They also used the language of branding to define their own value. Sandeep, a 2009 alumnus, pointed out that one's branch of engineering was no longer relevant. Even though they haven't done related courses, everyone is going into finance and business and marketing, he told me, adding that despite their disregard for the engineering curriculum, IITians still get the best jobs because of the brand name. IIT Madras now offers a Master's of Science in Entrepreneurship, and a student-run entrepreneurship cell aims to foster an entrepreneurship culture on campus. Many Homeland alumni also endorse the diasporic branding project as good for the institution. As one put it, the brand is a kind of ISO mark. You're assured of quality, like when you see a car made in Japan, it immediately sells. However, not everyone echoed these commitments to branding and entrepreneurship. To compare alumni activity in the US and India, he responded without skipping a beat. In USA, it's brand building. Here, it's nation building. As examples of nation builders, he offered a diverse list of alumni, including an Ayurvedic doctor, a school principal, a minister of environment, a petroleum secretary, some journalists, and the head of an NGO working in primary education. These are all IITians who have contributed to the development of the country, he said pointedly. But all you hear about now is Silicon Valley. Another alumnus who now teaches at IIT Madras confided that the entrepreneurship craze, as he called it, was demoralizing for faculty, whose students were far more interested in attracting the attention of venture capitalists than in learning the curriculum. Now, instead of engineering, he remarked in frustration, all they want to understand is the business of business. Particularly noteworthy was the stance of some Tamil Brahmin alumni, who expressed a distaste for the blatant embrace of accumulation, which they felt was more aligned with a mercantile sensibility. They spoke of this as a disturbing departure from an older model of ascetic intellectualism that they claimed was a trademark characteristic of IIT Madras. One expressed his disquiet by saying, all these good Brahminical values that, at least in the minds of some people in the South, used to mean that you should be good in academics and intellectual pursuits, that should be the overriding ambition, and you shouldn't be taken in by these material things. All that has vanished. The invocation of bygone Brahminical values speaks volumes about the continuing transformation of upper caste identity. As with the opposition between the general and the reserved, and the gifted and the coached, new tensions have arisen between intellectual and entrepreneurial conceptions of merit. The diasporic model of merit, in which entrepreneurial wealth accumulation is elevated as its true measure, has not been embraced by all IITians. To their surprise, those who were once emblematic of upper-class meritocracy now find themselves resisting its most recent manifestation. So, to conclude, in post-independence India, new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation have emerged through the very process of democratic change. Rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we are witnessing is the leveraging of merit as an expression of upper caste identity, aimed at securing arenas of expertise and accumulation against democratizing changes. Such claims to merit make the inheritances of caste into markers of individual achievement. Tamil Nadu is an important precedent for understanding this process. By throwing into relief caste advantage as the basis of achievement, Dravidianism forced Tamil Brahmins into a reactive claim to merit as an expression of caste culture. From the 1990s, this dynamic expanded nationally, making more explicit the equation between caste and merit and polarizing consolidated groupings of upper and lower castes. Exam coaching was one spanner in the works that forced a redefinition of merit as both a caste and a class characteristic. And while in many respects diasporic mobility allowed for more unfettered accumulation, the project of racial self-definition has found detractors among homeland alumni who contest the equation of upper caste merit with entrepreneurial success. What does this process suggest for our understanding of democracy? For one, the claim to merit as upper caste property calls into question the widespread assumption that only lower castes engage in identity politics. Rather, we must see the claim to merit as an example of an identity politics aimed at shoring up historical advantages and forestalling progress towards a more egalitarian society. Second, the shifting expressions of upper caste identity and the shifting spaces of capital accumulation from land to central government employment, the domestic private sector, and the diaspora show the instability of privilege and the work that it takes to maintain the upper hand. Finally, these shifts in upper caste identity speak to the force of political opposition and the need to understand merit as a reactive claim against efforts at democratization. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Subramanian, for that wonderful talk. What we're going to do now is open this up for Q&A. I will begin by trying to take some questions that have been already posted on both YouTube and Zoom chat rooms. I'm obviously going to request everybody to stick to this talk. I know Professor Subramanian's book speaks to a number of registers that are contentious, to say the least, but it'll be useful if we actually engaged with Professor Subramanian on what she has had to actually say in the book or in this talk. In that spirit, I'm going to start with a clarification question that came on the YouTube chat room. This is from a listener called Kartikeya. His question is the following. Would the instance of 1951 petition mark the beginning of seeing general merit as being aligned towards talent instead of privilege for the entire country and not just Madras? Do you have examples from other places outside of Madras? I'll also club together another substantive question that also came on the YouTube chat room, directly speaking to what you had to say. This one is from Bipin, and his question is as follows. Many upper castes have projected and claimed victimhood against caste-based reservations, denying caste privilege, and by claiming economic poverty, they managed to get the EWS category. How does EWS change perceptions of meritocracy?
Great, thank you for those. In terms of the sort of knock-on effects of the 1951 verdict, part of my argument in the book is that it did sort of set the stage for first Tamil Brahmin claims to merit, and then a proliferating politics of meritocracy meritocracy, right? So this claim to merit as the non-reserved, right, which the 1951 verdict really fueled, becomes a much more generalized phenomenon. But I do see Tamil Nadu as a really important precedent for what became a more sort of nationwide set of dynamics. So yes, I am saying that the 1951 verdict and the kind of Tamil Brahmin response to it, and the Tamil Brahmin kind of leveraging of the verdict was a particularly important moment, right? It was a kind of starting point for what became a kind of much more widespread phenomenon. The question about victimhood is a really interesting one. So yes, this is not just an Indian phenomenon, right? These claims to victimhood on the basis of upper caste identity, right, is also kind of echoed in other places like the United States, where you similarly see whiteness now becoming the basis of a claim to victimhood, right? And similarly also against things like affirmative action, right? So what does this claim to victimhood actually do? So one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to say that, what we have seen over the post-independence period in India is a shift from a more kind of universalistic politics, right, on the part of upper caste to a more shrill identitarian defense of their own kind of their own sort of status and standing. And part of this identitarian defense, part of this turn to a more identitarian expression of upper casteness, part of that is this notion of victimhood, right? This idea that, in the kind of 70 odd years since independence, and as a result of certain kinds of state interventions towards democratization, the upper castes have gone from being subjects of privilege to being sort of victims, right? Victims of both the state and of lower caste rights politics. Now, the EWS quota is a really interesting one because one of the arguments against reservations that has been leveled all the way through, right, has been that instituting quotas on the basis of caste is illegitimate, right? That it's a violation of liberal democracy, right? Because it makes caste, which is seen as a kind of illiberal category, into the basis of legislation. And that instead, quotas should only be instituted on the basis of economic disadvantage, right? On the basis of class. Now, of course, if you actually, look at the Mandal Commission report, what it says is both that caste and class cannot be sort of neatly distinguished, right? But also that caste is an independent source of disadvantage and discrimination, right? That simply addressing class difference does not automatically mean that caste discrimination vanishes, right? And so, the commission makes both points, that sort of one has to think class and caste together, but also that that class cannot be is not the only basis of discrimination, and therefore instituting quotas on that basis will not correct for these other kinds of historical disadvantages, right? So what do I think about the EWS quota? I actually think it's a somewhat mischievous attempt at undercutting the legitimacy of caste-based reservations. And, it sort of, it uses the figure of the poor Brahmin in particular, right? I mean, this is a figure, if you read the sort of cases, especially the sort of most important cases that sort of went up to the Supreme Court, the cases on reservations, this kind of, the figure of the poor Brahmin is a trope that recurs over and over again. And it's a way of saying, again, it's a way of saying that that disadvantage is not just the plight, right, of the lower class, right? And you know, while that may be true, it is also undeniable that there are how to put this, there are caste networks and institutional supports for upper caste and for sort of poor upper caste that don't exist, right, for poor lower caste. So the story of upward mobility, of upward mobility for poor upper caste is a much more prevalent story, right, than similar forms of upward mobility for poor lower caste. My father is a sort of clear example of this. You know, he grew up in a poor Brahmin household, and went on to enter the Indian Railways as a civil servant, and then went on to be a development bureaucrat at the Asian Development Bank. I mean, this kind of rise in status was made possible by the kinds of institutional supports and social networks among Tamil Brahmins, right, among upper castes, that simply do not exist to the same degree for lower castes. So I hope that gets at the issue. I mean, the other thing that I'll say is that, you know, when people make these arguments about, you know, the kind of EWS argument is often sort of coupled with another argument about who is actually the beneficiary of caste quotas, right? So there's a constant sort of theme of the relatively advantaged, right, OBC individual as the real beneficiary of reserved quotas. That, you know, that reservations are not benefiting those that it should benefit. And again, I see this as a really sort of mischievous argument, because it kind of and I think one has to see it as a kind of recurring argument that is made by upper castes on behalf of poor backward castes and against, right, OBCs who they are in direct competition with. So I see it as part of yet another way of kind of undercutting OBC quotas, which to them are the sort of real threat, right, to their standing. I mean, far less SCs and STs. It's the kind of OBC, it's the sort of rise of OBCs which are sort of seen as the real threat. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to actually, I mean, there's been a lot of chatter on YouTube as well as Zoom chat. Obviously, we're not going to have time to answer every one of the questions. I'm going to try and bunch them into buckets. Sure. The first has to directly do with your ethnographic fieldwork at IIT Madras. One of the questions that has come up several times, actually, I mean, if I'm counting this right, at least a dozen times, is the impact that the humanities department at IIT Madras has had in making caste visible, right? So, I mean, there have obviously been people who are writing caste became a problem at IIT Madras only because they started a humanities department. And there are also listeners that are writing, maybe this is not so much as invisible as it used to be, because we now have the humanities department, you have the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle, so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think there's some interest in getting your sense based on your fieldwork on campus on what the impact of humanities departments and scholars therein has made. Whether has it made caste visible, invisible? How has it transformed the caste invisibility problem?
Sure. I mean, I think that this argument that somehow either the humanities department or groups like the APSC have brought caste into a campus that was previously caste free. I mean, one really has to kind of interrogate that assumption, right? I mean, what does it mean to say that an institution like IIT Madras, which was, before the institution of quotas, was predominantly upper caste? What does it mean to say that these were caste-free campuses, right? I mean, I think what it does is it sort of, I mean, this claim sort of operates on the assumption that, again, upper castes are casteless, right? And that the spaces that they inhabit are by extension also casteless. And caste only becomes a factor when privilege is challenged, right? And I mean, that simply cannot hold. It doesn't make logical sense. Now, the role of the humanities department in bringing caste questions more to the forefront at places like IIT Madras, certainly. I don't doubt that. Now, what is interesting, and this is, I know that there are lots of IITians on the call, and this may not be the experience of everybody, but one of the things that I found really interesting is that a lot of students a lot of undergraduates, right, who come to the IITs to get engineering degrees and have to fulfill a humanities requirement. I mean, what I heard over and over again is that that they favor classes either in management, which do fulfill the humanities requirement, or classes in philosophy, right? And less so classes on sciences, right? Which are more likely to address questions of social inequality, the historicity of caste, etc. And so what this suggests to me is that even the presence of the humanities department and the availability of courses on social inequality, on the kind of persistence of caste inequality, sort of within democracy, within within democratic societies, that these haven't had the kind of impact that they ideally should have, right? And in fact, the reaction to the APSC and the kind of programming that the APSC does. I mean, the APSC doesn't just put on programs to do with caste. I mean, they put on programs to do with neoliberalism and the new education policy and linguistic nationalism. I mean, there are all kinds of topics that are taken on, and I mean, they've been met with a really hostile reaction, right? So the very presence of the APSC has been polarizing. I mean, it's really sort of produced a standoff between students who want to take up questions of caste rights and sort of promote a more critical interrogation of caste, and those who are absolutely unwilling to do so. And this kind of second group is also one that has increasingly sort of aligned itself with a kind of Hindu nationalist project, right? And so this polarization suggests to me that, yes, maybe caste is a more openly discussed issue, but as a result of that, it has really sort of exposed these fault lines in a way that might lead some to say, oh my God, now there's casteism on campus. There was always casteism on campus. It just wasn't sort of front and center because there weren't these kinds of challenges to caste privilege, right? That provoked a reaction. Yeah.
Thank you. The second most busy theme, if you will, this evening has been, I guess partly thanks to the now famous Cisco case happening in the US. People are asking related questions around how does the Indian diaspora view meritocracy in the US? And there were also some pointed questions about the famous Harvard case in terms of Indians in the US or Indian origin students in the US losing out on Harvard admissions, undergraduate admissions. And there were a number of questions there. The questions seem to point out that there is a meritocracy argument there, and you might want to talk a little bit on that. So how was meritocracy exported to the US and how is it used within Indian diaspora, and a specific Harvard related question?
Right. Okay. So, what's interesting about kind of the Indian American position, I suppose, on US-based affirmative action. And I heard this from several of my interviewees, right? Some of them, very sort of pointedly contrasted reservations with affirmative action, right? So for some of them, reservations are illegitimate in a way that affirmative action is not. And so let me just elaborate on that. Because affirmative action in the US has moved steadily away from a kind of redress model to a diversity model. In other words, affirmative action has moved away from seeing moved away from recognizing the need to correct for historical and enduring social inequalities, right, to embracing diversity, right, as a value in itself. And so now the only way that one can address affirmative action is through recourse to diversity, right? So that's the only argument that really holds. The US never had quotas as such, but at least at an earlier moment, affirmative action recognized, right, that this was a corrective for historical injustices. That is no longer the case. So, the fact that affirmative action is now kind of implemented in the US through this, through the selection of uniquely meritorious individuals from underrepresented social groups, all in the name of enhancing institutional diversity. For the IITians I spoke to, this way of addressing the question of affirmative action is consistent with liberal democracy, right? Because it is all about kind of the meritocratic individual. And they sort of contrast this to the way reservations work in India, which is through quotas and which is through redress, right? It's not about diversity; it's about redress. So a lot of Indian Americans are actually in favor of the kind of diversity model, right, of affirmative action, because it benefits them, right? As non-white Americans, it benefits them, right? They don't qualify as underrepresented minorities, but they do qualify when it comes to, racial and ethnic diversity. Now, that what is interesting about Indian Americans being visible in the US primarily as racial and ethnic minorities is that caste differences within the Indian American community are rendered illegible, right, or invisible. And this is where I think the Cisco case is so important, because what it does is it exposes the fault lines within the Indian American community. It shows that, that the story is a little more complicated than simply, Indian Americans being an affluent, but still a minority, right? So when you look with what the Cisco case does is it shows that patterns of migration to the United States have been profoundly shaped, right, by histories of caste, right? That the reason why the Indian American population is overwhelmingly upper caste, more so than any other node of the Indian diaspora, is precisely because of the nature of migration, right? So the 1965 Immigration Act, which kind of opened the floodgates to migration from India. I mean, this was an act that targeted professionals. It set in motion a kind of pattern of migration, right? Where the most educated, the most kind of professionalized groups were the ones who sort of made it over. And and because of that, the population is overwhelmingly upper caste. So the Cisco case will kind of illuminate those patterns to an American public in a way that has just not been visible yet. Yeah, so that's why I think it's important. I mean, the hope. So at the moment, the only institution in the United States that has incorporated caste as part of its non-discrimination policy is Brandeis University. No other institution does. No other institution recognizes caste or incorporates it into its policy, whether public or private. And so, one thing that might happen as this case moves forward is kind of momentum around making caste yet another legally recognized basis of discrimination, right? And then, sort of extending from that, the insistence that caste should also be the basis of recruitment, right? That diversity should take into account caste and the need to consciously target underrepresented caste groups within American institutions. Yeah.
Thank you. There were a number of questions which you actually addressed in your book, but I'm assuming not everybody has read the book here, around researcher privilege. So the broad drift of the question were, how might a Dalit have written a book like this? So that's one theme. And given that we are running out of time, I also wanted to throw at you a question that speaks to the Bourdieusian sociology that you use in the book. This is a question from somebody called Samadrita. I hope I got that name right. The question reads, I was curious about two aspects in relation to Bourdieu and the aspects of embodiment. The lower castes having embodied manual labor as opposed to intellectual labor, do we find something similar in terms of different streams within the larger umbrella of engineering? Secondly, as we see geographies as newer determinants of capital, do Brahmins and or other upper castes claim disadvantage based on the rural-urban divide?
Can you repeat the second question about geography? Yeah.
Secondly, as we see geographies as newer determinants of capital, do Brahmins or other upper castes claim disadvantage based on the rural-urban divide?
Okay, so researcher privilege. Yeah, I mean, it's hugely significant. I mean, one's positionality as a researcher is always significant, right? We are all embodied beings, both the researcher and the researched, and those forms of embodiment and social location are unmistakable factors, right? In what one studies, how one studies, what one has access to, what one writes, all the way through. I very, very consciously chose to write a book about upper casteness. And granted, it is a kind of argument about upper casteness as an expression of identity that is intimately tied to and responsive to lower caste rights politics, right? But the focus of the book really is on upper caste, right? Upper caste self-conceptions, upper caste strategies, and the kind of the forms of capital, right, that are accumulated in a kind of both historically and continuing into the post-independence period, right? So, and I chose to focus my research in this way, precisely because in addition to my wanting to write a book about caste privilege and not about caste disadvantage, I was really interested in in kind of studying elites, right? My first book, Shorelines, in some ways is the sort of other side of the spectrum, right? It's on a kind of lower caste population of fishermen and women. When I did that research, I mean, there was a kind of interesting, I mean, in some ways it was much more consistent with what anthropologists typically do, right? We tend to study the marginalized. And that is also an expression of privilege, right? And we as kind of highly educated professionals have access, sort of claim access to populations that are less advantaged. But often it's as an expression of solidarity, right? I mean, anthropology is kind of an overwhelmingly left of center discipline, right? So often, when you're studying subalterns, it's through a kind of sense of solidarity. Now, I really wanted to study elites. I wanted to study privilege because this is a kind of this is just not what anthropologists typically do, and because I was particularly interested in the operations of caste privilege. Yes, I think if a kind of Dalit researcher had done this project, it would look very, very different. I can't presume to know what it would look like, but it would certainly look different because, again, I mean, research is highly particular, right? And it's shaped by identities on both sides. I was able to access upper caste individuals and do the kinds of interviews that I did. I'm sure in part because they read me as upper caste, right? I mean, both my name, my institutional location at Harvard, I mean, all of this no doubt facilitated my ability to do this research. And that would not have been the case for a Dalit researcher. So yes, I think privilege is a huge factor, not just in the operations of caste in the world, but also in how research unfolds, right? So let me go on to the embodiment, the two questions about embodiment and geography. Yes, the colonial, so, in the talk, I sort of mentioned that in the colonial period, one sees this kind of tracking of people based on caste, right? So engineering becomes a kind of overwhelmingly sort of upper caste persuasion because it becomes this sort of means to kind of professional class standing. And on the other side, lower costs are kind of tracked into forms of industrial schooling, right? That, both both so that they can populate sort of the lower tiers of the kind of economy, and also so they, they're sort of, so that they can be industrial labor, essentially, right? So now, what does this distinction, this kind of caste distinction within technical education, how does it sort of play out in the post-independence period? Well, I mean, technical education is a hugely stratified field, right? I mean, you've got the IITs on top, and you've got the ITIs at the bottom. And if you actually look at the sort of social makeup of these institutions and the kind of jobs they're tracked to, I mean, it's clearly there's a clear kind of caste structure, right? That's in place. So IITians are overwhelmingly upper caste. They go into the professions. Most of them don't go into core engineering jobs, which require sort of forms of hands-on labor, right? That's not what they go into. And on the other side, you have a lower cost. I mean, when you look at core engineering jobs and who populates them, they are typically students from lower tier technical institutions, right? Which also happen to be institutions which are more lower cost in composition. So this kind of distinction between the mental and the manual, right? Or the conceptual and the practical, which has been so much a part of institutional stratification, I think has been yet another basis for the reproduction of caste, right? It's an interesting question about geography. I mean, I don't know. Yes, I mean, I agree that geographical location is a really key determinant of capital. I mean, this is partly what I was saying about transnational migration, right? That the diaspora has become a kind of geographical site for the retrenchment of certain forms of privilege and sort of the associated capacity to accumulate capital. Now, how does that play out on the rural-urban divide in India? I mean, just to go back to the question about sort of the EWS category, I imagine that this is one where a kind of rural upper caste location would come into play, right? I mean, this is speculation, but I imagine that if the rural was figuring as a source of disadvantage, I imagine that would be one way in which it would figure, right? I mean, the other interesting angle on this is what I talked about, which is the increasing presence in institutions like IIT Madras of rural upper castes, right? From Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and other places. So these are castes, like the Kammas and the Reddys who have agrarian capital, right? So they're wealthy, but they don't have the same forms of cultural capital, right? That a kind of urban upper caste individual would have, right? And so what you're seeing now is the effort to sort of bridge that gap, right? By sending their children to to the IITs, right? I mean, it's an effort to claim the forms of cultural capital that they don't possess as rural upper class. But they have economic capital, but not cultural capital. So that's and the forms of embodiment that I pointed to, right, which make them less ideal upper class. I mean, this is precisely what is sought to be overcome by the increasing kind of entry into the professional class and into sort of elite institutional spaces like the IITs. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's what I've got.
Thank you. My timer just went off, showing that we are at the end of our seminar. We've been here for 90 minutes. I'd like to thank you so much for being patient with all the questions. Obviously, we've not been able to take even a fraction of all the questions that have come up. I'll certainly collate all of them and email them to you.
That would be wonderful. And I hope that you can continue the conversation in my absence. If there is this much interest in this set of questions, I mean, you had said that my 2015 article kind of catalyzed some conversations at IIM, and I'm hoping that perhaps this session might do the same. If you're able to collate the questions, I mean, certainly send them to me because I would love to see them, but I'm hoping that they can be the basis for future conversations amongst yourselves.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Subramanian. I now call upon Professor M.S. Sriram, the chairperson at the Center for Public Policy, to formally bring the curtain down on this event.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for organizing this talk. And thanks a lot, Professor Subramanian, for coming in and spending your precious time with us. These are not easy conversations to have anywhere, forget about in IIM. So you've really opened up a whole range of issues for us to introspect, interrogate, and worry about, and possibly even act on as we go further. This is a fantastic conversation and very insightful. And also, it's not easy for you to spare so much of time, and thanks a lot for that. We would have loved to have you on campus so that we could have had more extended discussions, but that's not to be. We hope at a future date you'll be able to come down to the campus. And thanks a lot, Deepak, for moderating this so well. You'd asked me to moderate it. I remember that I'd said that you're the subject specialist and you should do it. And thanks a lot for doing it, because I wouldn't have done half as good a job as you've done. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for joining in.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Subramanian, again. Thanks a lot. And thank you, everybody. At some point during this event, we had 261 people across Zoom and YouTube, and about 180 actually stayed through the Q&A. So this clearly captured the on our campus. So thank you once again, Professor Subramanian.
Thank you.